All right, welcome in everybody to the deep dive. We've got a really fascinating one today. We are taking a look at the mind and the art of Bob Camblin. And this is a guy, an artist really, whose work spanned decades and shifted and changed and evolved in ways that I think still captivate people and sometimes leave people scratching their heads a bit.
Yeah, for this deep dive into Camblin, we've got a really interesting collection of sources to pull from. We've got, a number of his own quotes, his own thinking on things, a pretty thorough biography that covers, the main events in his life, the main influences in his life. There's a really thoughtful book review and a foreword from a book that features his art. It's called Zen and the Art of Enlightenment.
Okay.
We've got some excerpts from a YouTube video, somebody talking about one of his paintings, trying to make sense of it. We've got some really good historical context, some memories from a close friend, and some reviews of his work, going back to some of his exhibitions.
That's great. So, our mission, as always, is for you, our listeners, is to sort of sift through all this stuff and pull out the essential insights. We want to get to the bottom of what made this guy tick. What was the core of his artistic philosophy? How did his work change over time? And what are the recurring themes that we see again and again, weaving their way through all of his diverse creations? So think of this as like a cheat sheet to understanding this enigmatic but significant artist, Bob Camblin. So Camblin was born in Oklahoma back in 1928.
Yeah, that's right, 1928, Oklahoma.
Oklahoma. Okay.
And it seems like he had a deep appreciation for art, like right from the beginning. Came from an artistic family. And really early on, we see him already kind of like getting involved in art, taking on the role of art director for his high school yearbook.
Yeah.
That's already pretty serious responsibility for a high school kid.
Yeah, that is. That's interesting. It seems like his upbringing in Ponca City actually had a surprising influence on him too. The biography talks about the Marland Estate and the Pioneer Woman statue, and he returns to those like subtly again and again in his work, often using the initials VV.
Oh, interesting.
And I looked into this a little bit, and apparently VV was a reference to his mother. Her name was Viva Camblin. She was also an artist.
Oh, wow.
So it makes you think about how these local landmarks, these touchstones, can really become part of an artist, like a deep part of an artist's, their symbolic language, their visual, vocabulary.
Right. I mean, it shows how kind of the artist's immediate surroundings, the physical landscape, the cultural landscape, all of that can kind of seep into their artistic DNA in ways that we might not even always like recognize.
Right.
I mean, so this idea of the grandeur of the Marland Estate, right, and the iconic presence of the Pioneer Woman statue, they probably shaped his aesthetic sensibilities and kind of provided a visual language that he would draw on later.
Yeah. And here's a fun little thing. It says that The Wizard of Oz, the movie, had a huge impact on him as a kid.
Interesting.
So you can almost imagine how that fantastical world with its, vivid imagery and that whole idea of a journey into a kind of an unexpected world, how that could have really sparked, his own imagination, his later, exploration of the surreal and the symbolic.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the visual richness, the narrative journey of The Wizard of Oz, that whole kind of back and forth between the familiar and the fantastical. I mean, that could easily have really resonated with a young kid who's becoming an artist. It's potentially kind of laid the groundwork for his later willingness to explore things that are not just literal representations.
Right.
To really kind of delve into the realm of the imagination.
Totally. He also formed this really important early friendship with another artist, Forrest Harrisberger.
Right.
And it's interesting. It sounds like their bond at first wasn't even really about art. It was more of a personal connection.
Yeah, I mean, often it's those kind of foundational connections, those connections that seem kind of separate from art.
Right.
That can have a huge impact on the artist's journey.
Yeah.
So the shared experiences, the kind of understanding that they developed, maybe even before they were fully like focusing on art, that probably gave them a support system and a space to just kind of let their creative ideas develop, simmer.
Yeah. Yeah, and their paths continue to intersect in a really significant way.
Hmm.
After high school, their military service, and then the opportunity that they got through the GI Bill
Right.
led them both to the Kansas City Art Institute.
Wow.
So it's kind of amazing how these historical events can like pave the way for an artist's, development and even create these shared experiences that end up being so pivotal.
Right. And I mean, the GI Bill was huge, right? In making art education available to, a whole generation of veterans.
Right.
And so the fact that Camblin and Harrisburger both took advantage of that
Yeah.
is really significant.
Yeah.
And then going through that formal training together at the Kansas City Art Institute, that must have really, really just kind of cemented that artistic dialogue that they had
Yeah.
and given them even more of a common ground for their art to develop.
Right. It's fascinating. Now Camblin was also, it sounds like, a really voracious reader. Emerson, the I Ching, haiku, haiga.
Wow.
I mean, that's a really interesting range of influences, intellectual and artistic influences.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at that list, it's clear that he had, this really broad intellectual curiosity and these diverse philosophical underpinnings that were feeding into his artistic vision.
Yeah. And the simplicity and the, kind of profound observations that you find in haiku and haiga, they seem particularly relevant, when we look at later descriptions of his work
Right.
and even some of his own statements about art. They're often very concise. Sometimes, they're kind of enigmatic. But it kind of makes sense.
Right.
I mean, he was engaging with these forms that are so concise, but yet so evocative, and it seems like that might have instilled in him a real, appreciation for capturing big meaning with just minimal elements.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And then we think about Emerson, right? And
Yeah.
Emerson's focus on individualism and self-reliance,
Yeah.
that might have fueled his independent artistic spirit.
Totally.
The I Ching's focus on change and interconnectedness.
Right.
Well, that might have informed his exploration of these kind of recurring cycles and relationships in his artwork.
Right.
It all kind of ties together.
Yeah, it all starts to make sense. So moving on to his more formal education, the Fulbright scholarship that he got to go to Italy, that seems like a really pivotal moment in his development as an artist.
Yeah.
The biography talks about, the huge impact that the Uffizi Gallery had on him. I mean, obviously it's full of Renaissance masterpieces.
Right.
But then there's also this kind of unexpected influence, the Capuchin catacombs of Palermo,
Oh, wow.
with these, what are described as abstract figurative mummies. So you've got these, these incredible works of art, these Renaissance paintings, and then you've got these anthropological, figures, these mummies. It's a pretty interesting contrast.
Yeah, and I think that contrast is really telling.
Yeah.
On the one hand, he's at the Uffizi, surrounded by this incredible, artistic achievement, the pinnacle of the Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
And that definitely influenced his understanding of composition, form, the human figure.
Right.
But then the Capuchin catacombs, right? These bodies, these preserved bodies that are arranged in these almost abstract patterns.
Right.
That probably gave him this totally different perspective on the human form, on mortality, on the passage of time.
Wow.
And it really kind of hints at the complexity of his interests even then, early on.
Right. And we know that Botticelli was a big influence.
Wow.
The Birth of Venus, which I guess there's even a connection there to KPFT radio.
Oh, interesting.
So that's kind of cool, a local Houston tie-in.
Yeah.
But then also Botticelli's Primavera, which, he was so, captivated by, that led to his own Flora, this piece that's just full of hidden imagery. There are hearts, electrons, and there's even a subtle smiling face that's reminiscent of the Mona Lisa.
Oh, wow.
So he's already, engaging with these masters, these Renaissance masters.
Right.
But he's adding these little, contemporary twists,
Right.
these little hidden layers.
Yeah, it's clear that he wasn't just interested in copying the masters. Right? He was more about having this dialogue with tradition.
Right.
And I love that local tie-in with the KPFT radio. It kind of grounds his Birth of Venus in a specific time and place, and it gives this contemporary relevance.
Yeah.
And then the hidden imagery in his Flora. I mean, that's just so typical of Camblin.
Right.
This layering of meaning and inviting the viewer to look deeper.
Right.
To really engage with the work. So he's already kind of playing with the viewer's expectations. He's taking these classical forms and then he's imbuing them with his own unique symbolic language.
That's so cool. No, it's kind of interesting. Despite all this, really deep engagement with fine art, he actually spent a little time working as a map maker
Oh, wow.
before he, dedicated himself to teaching.
Yeah,
I mean, it's an interesting detour,
it is.
for someone so clearly drawn to art.
Yeah. Well, it could be that time-making maps actually did inform, even if it was subtly, his understanding of space and relationships perspective.
Yeah.
How do you translate three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional surface?
Right.
I mean, it's just a reminder that all of an artist's experiences, even the ones that are outside of their, primary field, can still kind of feed into their overall visual understanding.
Okay. So then he moves to Houston. He comes to Rice University. And it sounds like this is, Houston is really a much more fertile ground for him
Yeah.
to explore his, what he wants to do with art.
Right.
This period is marked by these really close friendships and collaborations.
Yes.
Earl Staley and Joe Tate,
Right.
which led to B&E Productions.
Yes.
And the holding firm.
I mean, yeah, his arrival at Rice was this huge shift toward a more collaborative and experimental art practice.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And finding people like Staley and Tate who are really kindred spirits.
Right.
It created this environment where they could really just go for it.
Right.
Challenge the traditions, explore new ways of expressing themselves all together. And even the names they chose for their collaborations, B&E Productions, the holding firm.
Yeah.
There's just this sense of this shared creative spirit.
Right.
And this very deliberate move away from being this individual artist,
Yeah.
I think this period really underscores how important community and dialogue were to his artistic development.
Right.
It's this collaborative and experimental nature of this time in Houston that really, I think, fueled his development of these really kind of iconoclastic philosophical ideas about what art was.
Yeah. And their shows were so unconventional. Tattoo Show, Joe Tate's Backyard, The Camping Show.
Right. Just the titles alone tell you that they're trying to
Yeah.
blur the lines between art and everyday life.
Yeah.
They're pushing against that traditional gallery setting.
Totally.
It's not about, presenting these kind of polished, finished pieces. Right. It's about exploring the process of creation.
Right.
And engaging with art in these unexpected contexts.
Yeah.
And it's not about, it's really challenging that traditional idea of what art is and where you experience it.
Totally. And they weren't even, signing their names to a lot of this stuff. It was often anonymous artists.
Right. Which, in a field that's so often focused on the individual, the genius of the individual artist.
Yeah.
That's a pretty radical statement.
Yeah.
It really highlights how focused they were on shared creativity. It was about the work itself, like the shared experience of creating it, not about who gets the credit.
Yeah. That's a big part of his kind of evolving philosophy, it seems like.
Absolutely.
So let's kind of dive into his overall artistic philosophy and how that changed over time. Early on, his work had this element of social protest to it, which is interesting because he was kind of combining social realism, so showing these recognizable social issues with non-objectivity, which moves away from literal representation.
Yeah. I mean, that early work, that really shows an artist who is engaged in the social and political landscape,
Yeah.
But he's also exploring these abstract means of expression to convey these deeper, emotional and conceptual meanings. It's not just about showing what he sees. It's about using abstraction to really kind of give those ideas a bigger impact.
Right. And we know he was inspired by Cremoni, his really meticulous draftsmanship, and then also these Etruscan terracotta figurines, which are, much more raw, this ancient kind of expressiveness. So, I mean, those are pretty different artistic influences.
They are, but I think it shows, this kind of appreciation that he had for both, technical skill and this kind of raw, primal form of expression. So Cremoni, his technical skills probably appealed to his sense of precision.
Right.
And then the Etruscan figures, that immediacy,
Right.
probably connected with this desire to express these fundamental human emotions
Right. Right.
and experiences
Right.
without all the formality.
Yeah. Yeah. And then later on, he kind of shifts towards these large scale drawings.
Right.
And they're not, they weren't sketches.
Or
They weren't prep work for paintings or anything like that. They were, he intended them as finished pieces.
Right.
So, that says a lot about how he was engaging with the medium of drawing
Right.
and how he saw its potential for real expression.
Absolutely. And by focusing on these large scale drawings as the end product,
Yeah.
he's really challenging the traditional, kind of hierarchy of artistic mediums.
Right.
Right? Like drawing used to be seen as just prep work for the real art.
Right. Right.
But he's saying no, drawing is a powerful form of artistic communication. It can stand on its own.
Right. Right.
He understood the power of line, of texture, of monochrome.
Yeah.
To really convey complex ideas and emotions.
Right. And he even talked about wanting to combine the poetic, sense of Hugo van der Goes,
Yeah.
a Northern Renaissance artist, really known for these incredible details and atmosphere.
Right.
With the emotion, the intensity, the raw emotion of Goya.
Wow.
The Spanish Romantic painter.
Right.
It's a big goal, right?
It is. It speaks to, this incredible, kind of artistic vision that he had.
Right.
To bring together those two strands, those two seemingly, different traditions.
Right.
It's like he was searching for this visual language
Yeah.
that could be subtle and evocative, but also just like hit you in the gut.
Right. Uh,
Powerful and direct.
Right.
It's a really ambitious goal.
Yeah, it really is. And then you have Mush's Volantes, this collaboration with Nancy Giordano, where they're using dots and dashes to create optical illusions. It's Escher.
Yeah.
It's Dali.
Yeah, I mean, the Mush's Volantes period, it just shows you how restlessly creative he was.
Right.
And this fascination he had with how we perceive reality.
Right.
He's creating works that really play with your eyes, with your mind, and he's pushing beyond just this straightforward representation of the world.
Right. Right. So, and we start to see these recurring themes in his work. The life cycle, metamorphosis, which he connects to Glass's dog ears, myths, legends, scarecrows, puppets, skulls, murky water, often in reliquaries. I mean, it's a really interesting set of motifs.
Right. I mean, they're so rich in symbolic meaning.
Right.
All these recurring images.
Right.
And I think it really gives us this glimpse into his deeper concerns. The ideas about change, storytelling, death.
Yeah.
These hidden aspects of existence.
Right. And it's interesting, too, how he uses text in his drawings.
Yeah.
It's not always, straightforward.
Right.
Sometimes it's a clue. Sometimes maybe it's a trap.
Right.
Like he's questioning that traditional dominance of words.
Right.
And it made me think of Tom Wolfe.
Yeah.
The painted word.
Yeah.
About how the art world can sometimes be so obsessed with theory, or for the actual visual experience.
Right. And so Camblin he's challenging our dependence on language, to interpret visual information.
Yeah.
And by making the text in his drawings, kind of ambiguous or even contradictory,
Right.
He's highlighting the limits of words.
Right.
And maybe he's kind of prioritizing, the viewer's more direct,
Right.
sensory and intuitive response to the art.
Right. Right. So, I mean, his drawings become almost like puzzles, right?
Right.
They've got these codes and these traps,
Right.
And it forces the viewer to really participate in the search for meaning.
Right.
You can't just passively look at a Camblin drawing.
Right. He's not letting you off the hook.
Yeah. You have to work for it.
He's making you an active participant.
Right. Right.
In the creation of meaning.
Right. And we know that his aim was to question our kind of standard understandings of reality.
Yeah.
He wanted to push beyond surrealism.
Right.
He even said that he wanted to remake Goya in 20th century terms,
Right.
Much like Cézanne and Poussin,
Really?
who, reinterpreted earlier artistic traditions.
Yeah, I mean, that goal to remake Goya.
Right.
It shows how deeply he understood art history,
Right.
and how he wanted to contribute to its evolution.
Yeah.
Like Cézanne and Poussin, he wanted to take what came before and build on it,
Right.
create something new, a
Right.
new language for his own time.
Right. And what's interesting is, despite all this kind of intellectual and philosophical depth, he also emphasized, common sense
Right.
and a real faith in good work as being essential tools for navigating, what he called the art game.
Right, and that grounding is so important,
Right.
to balance out the more kind of abstract ideas.
Right. Right.
It shows that he understood that while conceptual exploration is vital,
Right.
the real foundation of a meaningful art practice
Yeah.
is in the work itself.
Right. Right.
It's in that dedicated,
Yeah.
everyday work,
Right. And finally, there's that recurring image of turning stumbling blocks into stepping stones.
Right.
And often that's represented by jars of water,
Right.
where the sediment settles and then the water becomes clear.
Right.
It's a beautiful metaphor.
It is.
Yeah.
It's just this beautiful visual metaphor for his whole philosophy.
Right. Yeah.
This idea that the difficulties, when we face them with patience,
Right.
with a willingness to just let things settle, they can actually lead to clarity.
Yeah. Right.
They can become a foundation for growth.
Right. Right. So now let's turn to some of Camblin's own words, some of his quotes that we have, and they really, I think, provide an even more direct, an even more personal view of how he thought.
Right.
So he says, fortunately, some things remain forever, or another 10 years, perhaps.
Right.
It's this beautiful kind of, mix of longing for things to be permanent and,
Right.
and acknowledgement that everything changes.
Yeah, it really captures that tension,
Yeah.
that we all feel between wanting things to last
Right.
and knowing that nothing really does.
Right. Right.
And I love that little touch at the end, or another 10 years perhaps.
Right.
There's this humor there, this kind of wry humor,
Right.
and this realistic acceptance of just how fleeting life is.
Right. Right. He says, as they approached, the memory of songs and music stopped. Stopped at the moment the texture of its decay became visible to them. Sad how we all aged at that moment in time.
Wow.
That's a really powerful observation.
It is.
About how remembering something,
Right.
can also be a way of seeing how the past is fading.
Right. It really, I mean, it's so evocative, it's melancholic, it's nostalgic.
Yeah.
But it also has this touch of sadness,
Mhm.
like remembering something precious
Right.
can also remind us that it's gone,
Right.
that time has passed.
And then on the interconnectedness of things, he says, look into the atom, you get what you need. Look into magic, and you get what you need. Philosophy and art are in both. So, I mean, he's seeing some kind of fundamental unity
Right.
underlying these, seemingly different,
Right.
areas of inquiry.
I mean, it points to this really holistic worldview, right?
Yeah.
Where truth can be found through science,
Right.
but also through these more intuitive explorations,
Right.
maybe even mystical explorations.
Right.
And he's implying that these different areas of knowledge, they're all connected.
Yeah.
They're not really separate.
He talks about the perfectly average view of the universe,
Right.
believing that if he could achieve that,
Right.
he could really appreciate the miraculous in both science and magic.
That's so interesting. I mean, it's such a unique way to think about reconciling the rationale and the mysterious.
Yeah.
Right. This idea of the perfectly average.
Yeah.
It's not about being mediocre.
Right.
It's about finding this balance, this perspective that allows for both rational understanding and an appreciation for the things we can't explain.
Right. He says that the sixth sense